Year 10 and 11, welcome to your comparison of the poems War Photographer and Kamikaze in preparation for your AQA English Literature poetry exam. In a comparative essay, we naturally need to show that we can compare the two poems via structure and language, and we need a range of connectives to do so. The top connectives in black there are when there is a difference between the devices used, and the red ones are if the devices are similar. So you've got whereas on the other hand, however, in contrast, unlike, alternatively. And as I say, if they are similar, similarly, likewise, equally, as with, and in the same way. So we have to show the examiner that we are comparing the poems. The variation on the word shows here when we are discussing devices and what they show the reader. So you've got suggests, implies, outlines, highlights, describes, communicates, connotes, emphasizes, reveals, displays and establishes, portrays, represents, illustrates, informs, means, conveys and symbolizes. If we start with structure then, and the structural devices used, we'll start with War Photographer on the left, and then we'll move to Kamikaze. So, in War Photographer, you have got the poem uses 4 regular stanzas, which could reflect the strict routine of the military. And this rigid order contrasts with the chaos of war. Also, it reflects the photographer's life. He feels that by taking these photographs, he is restoring some of the order that has been lost in conflict. Another suggestion is that each stanza could be symbolic of the different photographs he takes. Your rhyming couplets show a contrast in emotions. We have the detached reader, which we know from the last line, they don't care, and the soldiers. And the emotions that these two feel are very different. Also, we see that the photographer is clinical when doing his job, but more emotional when he returns home, and the rhyming couplets highlights that difference. Your use of enjambment reflects the inevitability of conflict within society, and the idea that war and conflict is very difficult to stop. And more specifically in this poem, the role of the photographer continues in the same way. He takes the photographs, he returns home, and no one cares. And he repeats that cycle. We also have the caesura. And the caesura is the photographer realising what he has taken photographs of. When he returns home, it dawns on him what he has taken a picture of and what he has witnessed. And he tries to compose himself, and he tries to compose his emotions, and it is futile because he breaks down. So your caesura is almost this stop-start hesitation and composure and losing emotion, losing control of emotion. Arguably, and you can disagree with me here, the volta is the line something is happening. That again, that is my interpretation. I'm not saying I'm right there. You might think the poem changes tone elsewhere or doesn't change tone at all. I think it changes tone here when he witnesses the photograph develop, when he realises the consequences of just standing there and taking the photograph of this helpless man, and more so the helpless wife. And the change of tone is because we then, as a reader, do ask ourselves how much we care. If we move to structure in Kamikaze, we've got 7 regular stanzas, so there's a similarity between the two. Again, it's the routine of the military, and it is similar to War Photographer because the rigid order contrasts with the chaos of war. But it's different here in Kamikaze because your 7 regular stanzas reflects the tradition of the Japanese army and the very specific tradition of a kamikaze pilot and the idea of risking your life for this country. And as we know, defying this tradition is massively frowned upon. A difference between the two, where war photography uses rhyming couplets, Kamikaze uses free verse to create a serious tone. It also represents the lack of freedom the pilot has in the middle of his mission. He feels like he does not have a choice other than to sacrifice his life. It also represents the hostility he faces when he returns home and how his life is ruined because he defies this tradition. A similarity is that both poems use enjambment. However, in this poem, Kamikaze, it's the enjambment allows the poem to flow rapidly and represents the movement of the Kamikaze plane spiralling downward. It also represents the spiraling out of control of the pilot's life. And also in places, the pilot recalls childhood memories which overtake his ability to complete the mission. Again, Shazera and Volta are both used in Kamikaze, which is similar to War Photographer. The Shazera in Kamikaze is the speculation about the pilot's reasons. And these pauses offer us as a reader a chance to consider why he returns home. And we don't quite get the right answer, but we do try and fill in these pauses. Is it because he misses his family? Is he terrified? Is it because he's remembered memories of childhood and he wants to go back and see his life through? And we have the Volta. And your Volta is at the line, but halfway there, because this is obviously when he changes his mind and returns home. And the whole poem then changes because we realise how hostile his family and society is. If we now move to language in the two poems, War Photography uses the pronoun his to show that there is a detachment. There's a detachment between us and the photographer, us and the soldiers, but also the photographer and the soldiers. In his dark room, he is finally alone. He is detached away from everything he's witnessed. And the adjective dark has connotations of death, and therefore, immediately, the poem has a negative tone. And again in that line, we've got finally in his dark room, he is finally alone, and it stinks of desperation, doesn't it? As if he's longed to be home, as if he's longed to be isolated from the conflict. And we've also got the emotive language in alone there. It's a place of safety for him away from the war. And it's like relief, isn't it? In his dark room, he is finally alone. So the desperation becomes relief. And then we move to the metaphor, huge metaphor in this poem, spools of suffering. Now, the alliteration of the S sound makes the suffering more permanent and more memorable. The spools of suffering, it sounds uncomfortable. But the word spools more specifically is chaotic, isn't it? And it's the idea that death in a war zone can't be stopped, and it's uncontrollable. And in this line, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows, this is what I said earlier. It's the photographer trying to restore some order to the chaos he has witnessed through the photographs. We move to the only light is red and softly glows. Adjective red we know has connotations and is symbolic of death, blood and danger. And he's standing in the photography room that is red. And naturally, because of the spools of suffering and because of the photographs he's taken, we are reminded of blood and death, because essentially he has taken photographs of those two things. And that is a huge image in the poem. There is religious imagery in stanza 1, I haven't mentioned it here, about the priest. I think the photographer feels like a priest to some degree here. A priest obviously will see people before they die, or will be in touch with people who are dying. and is close to death. And I think the photographer feels like that in this instance, that he's seen these soldiers die. We then get stanza 2 and we start with a short, simple sentence. He has a job to do, and it's very matter of fact, and it's very abrupt, and there's no time for emotion. And this again links back to what I said about detachment. That he knows he has to detach himself emotionally because he has to complete his job. But the metaphor that follows that again reminds us of what's been witnessed. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. And you've got the metaphor of the solutions slopping in the tray and the alliteration. And it refers to how he hopes that these photos will resolve the conflict. But if we look at slop, again, it's chaotic. And I think it does remind the reader that actually, to some degree, the photographs are futile and pointless because they won't resolve anything. They won't restore any order to a conflict. They won't make the reader care more. And in that instance, there's quite a sad tone there. As the solutions slop in the trays, we get his hands trembling and emotive language in tremble. Now, he didn't tremble during the war because, as we said earlier, he has a job to do. He knew he had to complete his work. But now, as he's home, the emotion starts to dawn on him and we get tremble. So physically, he is disturbed at what he's seen. And he trembles as he starts to see the developed pictures. He has tried to distance himself from the people, but now he suffers. If we move to Kamikaze, and then the next slide I'll do War Photographer and Kamikaze again. So Kamikaze, the language appears to be natural and everyday. However, some devices invite the reader to think about what the pilot may have seen from his plane. It adds to the power that he's changed his mind. It also shows the daughter has thought about this, because remember, this poem is from someone else's perspective, from possibly the perspective of the daughter, because it starts with her father. Now we get her father embarked at sunrise. Embarked here has a double meaning: to board the plane or to embark on a new adventure. So actually, we have positive connotations of something that is done willingly, as if he has willingly decided to become a kamikaze pilot and defend his country. Naturally, this will change. The line, a shaven head full of powerful incantations and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history, is massive. Now, the shaven head full of incantations is part of the ritual that the men displayed their readiness to fight, as well as remaining dignified in death. They would shave their heads. So this imagery for us is huge. And we've got the enjambment running all the way through here. So we've got this very fast-paced rhythm of he's embarking on a journey, he's got his samurai sword, he's shaved his head, he's going to make history. And we also get the idea of him embarking on a journey at sunrise. And naturally, we associate sunrise with something positive again. So in Japan, this tradition of the kamikaze pilot is something that they hold dear and something that they see as very positive, and they take it very seriously, which sets us up for the vaulter in stanza 2 when he changes his mind. Journey into history interestingly finishes this first stanza, and it's a short line, journey into history, and it highlights the honour and recognition that they would receive, that they would never be forgotten. Now, as I say, stanza 2 begins with your vaulter, journey into history. Sorry. Stanza 2 begins with your vaulter, but halfway there, and there's your change in tone. That is the moment he changes his mind. That is the moment he returns home. And it is segregated by the Shazira, but halfway there, comma, she thought, comma, and it gives us time to pause and think, oh my God, he's changed his mind. Now, the daughter is guessing, she thought, she is guessing, and others are guessing, and generations are speculating about why he changes his mind, because the pilot never speaks. Because remember, he is shunned by society. If we go back to war photography, just because of the way I've split the slide into two, and then we, as I say, we'll go and compare that to Kamikaze. So we get ordinary pain. Again, big statement here. Home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. Now, ordinary pain is trivial here, and it's the idea that our emotions change based on weather. And we've all been there, haven't we? Oh, it's sunny, you feel better, or it's raining, so we feel down. And we have the terrifying adjective ordinary here. So in the face of war, and in the face of what soldiers experience, our pain is ordinary. And actually, it isn't pain at all. And that runs into the running children in a nightmare heat. And it's, again, our children are free to play outside. They can go and play and they can come back. And we get this idea that the other countries that are involved in a war zone, it's a nightmare, because their children can't just go outside and play, and they can't enjoy the happy, innocent lives that children enjoy. And we take it for granted, don't we? We are reminded that we take these things for granted. To fields which don't explode beneath the feet of children. So we've got this image that we would associate with something dead innocent, and it becomes sinister because of the horror of war. Stanza 3 begins with what I argue could be the Volta, something is happening. Short sentence, abrupt, creates drama and suspense. The photographer has no control. Even though he thinks he's restoring control and order, he hasn't. And we get the huge imagery of the man dying, the half-formed ghost. It is a metaphor, isn't it? Because it's not a ghost at all. Because in this photograph, he's dying. And the picture gradually develops, and therein is some of your enjambment, this slow build up of the picture. And interestingly, we get the word stranger. Again, the theme of detachment. Do we care if it is a stranger? And that is coupled with twist. A stranger's features faintly start to twist, and it's uncomfortable, and it sounds painful. It's probably also the pain the photographer feels as he watches the photograph develop. And if we think it can't get any worse, it does. We get, he remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. So he needs approval from the soldier's wife before he takes the photograph. He remembers the cries, emotive language. Naturally, she's crying. Her husband is dying. Does that make what he does more harrowing because he just takes the photograph, or not? And then we get the metaphor to finish that stanza of blood stained into foreign dust. The memory is unforgettable. War cannot be forgotten. Pain will last. Look at the word stained, as if it can't be removed. Move back over to Kamikaze. In stanza 2, we get he must have looked far down, and the modal verb must creates a bond between the pilot and the narrator. And this appears to be an attempt to justify the pilot's actions. We also consider what he might have missed out on. The narrator here is aligned with the pilot and shows sympathy towards him. In the same stanza we get the little fish boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And that simile is associated, bunting, with celebrations. And again, this contrasts with the main ideas of the poem: death, sacrifice, war. And again, we are encouraged to think about, well, actually, is he making the right choice here? Because he's going to miss out on the rest of his life. And we've got the natural imagery of the little boats and the blue sea. Is it the power of nature that has forced him to turn round? He doesn't want to miss out on life and the natural world. And the repetition of the S and the F sound creates pace and mimics the aircraft. In particular, when we move to swiveled. In stanza 3, we get the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. And it recalls the spiral, the fatal spiral that the pilots used to hit their targets, because they would spiral downwards and crash into ships. But the narrator, as I say, recognises natural beauty of the fish and the sea, and that could have discouraged him. We've got the dark shoals of fish, the little boat, the blue sea, the sun, the metaphor of the tuna, the dark prince, and the image of the loose silver of white bait suggests a comparison with coins of possibly sunken treasure. And the impression there is that the sea holds great wealth to him. The natural world is very important to him. And the idea of sacrificing his life becomes too much. When we get to stanza 4, he begins to reminisce about his brothers. And remembered how he had his brothers waiting on the shore. We get the pearl grey pebbles, the father bringing in the boat. But in there we get words turbulent and safe, and that is contrasting vocabulary. The turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe, and that highlights the turmoil and the confusion of him, so that is huge. Please get that juxtaposition of turbulent and safe. It shows us that in his mind he's not quite sure what to do and if he's making the right decision. And unfortunately, as we carry on the poem, the decision he makes ruins his life. Either way, his life is ruined. Once again, we've got lack of punctuation as he recalls the memories, and the memories take over his ability to complete the mission. Stanza 6 is massive because we get that huge line. My mother never spoke again in his presence. It's very tense. Is the mother embarrassed? Is she disgusted? And that is split over a number of lines. Again, enjambment is massive here. The question about the mother becomes prolonged, like the pilot's suffering. Stanza 6, listen. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Stanza 6 is awful. We realise that nobody will entertain him, won't even look at him, won't speak to him. So then we ask ourselves as a reader, should he have just completed the mission? Would that have actually been less painful in the long run? And finally, our last slide. Again, I'll start with War Photographer and move over to Kamikaze. So we get the metaphor, 100 agonies in black and white. And we've got this idea that the images are very painful, aren't they? And does the lack of colour censor the images a bit more? Potentially. But look at the word 100. There's many pictures to choose from, and that contrasts with his editor will pick out 5 or 6. Again, the editor has no regard and no care. As long as he picks the right 5 pictures for the newspaper, he's done his job. And for a fleeting second, I suppose, we realise the carelessness here. And this leads us into the reader's eyeballs prick with tears metaphor. For a fleeting second we feel upset, but it'll pass. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between bath and pre-lunch beers. So we move on, don't we? We move on as our life moves on, and we don't have any regard for what we've witnessed in the paper. The last line is huge. We get from the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns a living and they do not care. He stares impassively at is him looking down. It's him looking down on England, isn't it, as he's on a plane. And the pronoun they is once again detachment. He feels detached from the reader. He feels detached from us. And he eventually accepts that the photographs will make no difference. They do not care. And it concludes the entire poem. So the war photographer finishes on quite a sour note here. We would argue that we do care, but actually, to a certain extent, he has proven that we don't, because of how quickly we will move on after viewing the images. If we move back to Kamikaze then, in stanza 7, after we hear that the mother has disowned the pilot, we get till gradually we learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Stanza 7, much like War Photographer, is massive. It's hugely important and hugely emotional. We've got the modal verb must again to create that bond where the narrator's trying to justify the pilot's actions. He must have wondered. It's speculation though, isn't it? He must have done this, he must have done that, because we don't know. There appears to be a hint of desperation in the tone here, as though the narrator wants us to feel sorry for him, and we do. And the adjective silent does that for us. We too learned to be silent, and it's very tense. So we know that even the children, his grandchildren, nobody acknowledges him. And how inhumane that really is. That this was no longer the father we loved. That is how big the implications of his actions are. They don't love him anymore because he has defied and betrayed his country. And that is a notion that is actually difficult to comprehend here. That's the reason they don't love him. And then we get, and sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So the last line has a massive impact. Because, as I say, would it have been better to kill himself in the war than to return to this life? I think a lot of us would say yes. Because he returns to a life. In fact, he returns to no life. He doesn't have his family. His memories, therefore, will be ruined. He won't have the same feeling of content in his life without their love. So both poems finish in quite a disturbing manner. I hope this video has been useful as a comparison of structure and language in War Photographer and Kamikaze, and good luck in your poetry exam.